I brought up the analogy of a man beating his wife. I admit to that. And the reason I did that is to show that there are similar situations where where there are no principal differences, which is that an individual sees a subjective threat, presumably in this situation to someone else, but it could be to them, right? And they call the individuals in. No, Nina, I'm winning. Shut up so I can finish winning.
A Sikh man was denied entrance into an NBA game because he was carrying a ceremonial dagger. The dagger, called a kirpan, guessing on that one, is an article of faith and must be worn at most times. The Sikh man tried to explain this to security, but was still denied. This incident comes after a viral video of a Sikh college student being handcuffed for the same offense. The college later changed its policies to allow for kirpans. What should be the limit of religious tolerance? Should we expand what we find acceptable, especially when talking about non-Western religions? Or do we already have a good balance as it stands? This was an article about this individual, and like they have these daggers, these Sikhs individual. I never heard of this, but that's not surprising at all, really. Sikhs apparently who have like gone through this religious rite have to have like 5 religious articles on them, and one of them is it. And these are like real daggers. Like I could just Google it, Kirpan. That's like a real freaking dagger, and they're supposed to carry them around wherever they go. Is there a limit, right? Like this thing can be considered a weapon. It's a weapon. Should we say that this is too far, or should we try to be more understanding? Right, because maybe most Sikhs aren't criminals, so it's not a big deal in the first place. All right, so we'll start with our friend Lacto.
So I am also not a criminal, and so I want to point out that open carry is based, and I should be allowed to bring my AK-47 wherever I go. It is my religion. However, in general, the problem of infinite religious freedom leads to some reductios that I think we can all agree are a little bit crazy. And it was addressed by the Supreme Court in the landmark case, Employment Division versus Smith. In that case, a guy got fired for smoking a bunch of peyote as part of a religious ceremony, got real high and got fired. And then Oregon said, no, you don't get unemployment benefits because, hey, drug use disqualifies you from that. And then he sued, saying, well, no, it's my religion to get high off peyote. The Supreme Court made it clear, neutral laws of general applicability are not unconstitutional. A secular country does not and should not provide legal privileges for specific religions. I can't claim cocaine use or ritual sacrifice as my religion and expect that to just make it legal for me when it's illegal for everybody else. It also shouldn't be protected to say, well, I can just bring my sword into class now because, hey, it's my fucking religion. I am opposed to privileges for the religious, which allowing kirpans is. Instead, we should allow all students to bring swords into the classroom in the interest of equality, because that's what we want here. I want to quickly add one quick caveat. The Supreme Court did allow for states to pass some specific exemptions for certain religious groups, only as long as there was another right at issue. And importantly, states are not required to do so, right? As long as the law is neutral and generally applicable, it's totally fine. And also this exception was complete bullshit because it was put in place just to protect the Amish. And that's quite literally why it was there. And so it's just inconsistent. I hate it. A lot of modern justices say, yeah, pretty fucking stupid exception. But in general, no, you don't get special privileges just for being religious.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, let's go to our friend Scott.
Yeah. First, yes to everything Lactoid said. Second, private property owners should be able to discriminate on anyone for any reason whatsoever. I should be able to put up a sign that says no Jews allowed. Like, I should be able to do that. And then you should be able to go, I don't want to watch this basketball game because there's a sign that says no Jews allowed. Like, fuck these people. And this should be exactly the same for Sikhs. right? Like if a venue doesn't want to allow people to bring weapons into their venue, then they shouldn't be forced to, and we shouldn't have any say on that whatsoever. At the same time, it is also your right to say, hey, look, this guy's a Mandalorian, but in our world, and weapons are part of his religion, and he can't give up his weapons. And like, it's not that big of a weapon. You know what I mean? It's just a little fucking dagger. He's not going to cause a big problem. And like, I think you should allow these people. And if you don't like that they're barring it, then you shouldn't give them any business. And if you do like that because you want to go to a safe place where nobody has any weapons, then have at it. Like, it is only an issue because of public property. That is the only reason that things like this are a problem, is because there is this magical idea that we all together own property. And then there comes with that all types of inherent conflicts because only one person can own property. It's not possible for multiple people to own property. When you try and say that multiple people own property, what you end up with is you bake conflict into that system because different people want to use that property in different ways. Some people want to allow the Sikh Mandalorian to bring his blaster rifle into the basketball game, and some people don't. Like, it is really just, it's amazing because it highlights that conflict. So I do like this discussion, but ultimately, like, we shouldn't care. It's based to say, fuck you, I don't care how much community work you've done to us, you don't get to bring a knife in here. And it's also based for the university to go back on what they said and like, hey, we fucked up, like, this is a part of your religion and we want this to be an open space. Like, it needs to be up to the private property owner.
Thank you. Corey, please.
Yeah, so I'm maybe semi-qualified to speak on the matter as a Quebecer, and Quebec and religious symbols definitely has
and you can talk about it from a Canadian perspective as well, right? That's
fine. And actually, I'm totally gonna bring that in because just as Canada is way ahead of the U.S. when it comes to cannabis, Canada, or like more specifically Quebec, so real Canada, is way ahead of the U.S. when it comes to dealing with the Kirpan. Basically, I'll link the story in the Discord chat, but basically a Quebec high school student faced the exact same situation. And they won a Supreme Court case, pretty much allowing them to carry the Kirpan in the high school. I think if I remember correctly, I could be wrong, but I believe the compromise was like the dagger had to be sewn into the clothing. So that's essentially like, not fully inaccessible, but there's a burden to accessibility, I guess. But let's just say I'm an extremely secular person, and I generally try to advocate for that. So I'm not exactly in favor of religious symbols, so I'm not exactly sure what the answer is. What I will say is Quebec has faced this issue multiple times because there was a member of the National Assembly, a politician, that also had a Kirpan, and they also had to take legal action, and like, they weren't actually allowed into the National Assembly, to have their Kirpan in the National Assembly. But Quebec was super critical because they still have like a crucifix, or at one point they had a crucifix in the National Assembly. That has since been removed. But basically, I'm not an expert on the Kirpan, but I believe there is like a ceremonial version that doesn't really have any cutting ability. And so like, that's pretty much like as far as I go in terms of like allowable sort of like religious symbols. At least when it comes to that specific thing. But to answer sort of the prompts, do I think we should expand what we find acceptable when talking about non-religious or non-Western, let's say, symbols or religions? I would say the answer is no. I will pretty much always advocate for pretty much more and more secularism. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Let's go to Jay Chow.
Yeah, so I have two sides, and the first is on religious freedom, which I think should be limited in cases of protecting the common good and limiting people's ability to do harm, which kind of maybe relates back to the Kirpan because it is a dagger, and people could see that as a weapon, but some courts have also determined that it is not a weapon. They have not like thrown Sikhs in jail because they were like carrying a weapon, even if it was a Kirpan. So I think
this is coming from someone that
says
he needs mace
that, like,
to
we kind of
safely
have
walk
to meddle
New York
with,
City.
of like, hey, do we consider this a weapon, or do we consider this something that
because
is
he's
just
Asian.
like a religious item? I kind of don't know where I sit. Like, I think it's fine. Like, if I had a Sikh sitting next to me and they had a Kirpan, like, so long as you don't whip it out and like start flinging it around, then like I'm kind of cool with you having it. Like, so long as it's not doing harm. So like there's a difference between having it could do harm versus them actually doing harm. The other side of me is, God, I fucking hate religion. Oh my God, just get with the times. Like, be smarter. Come on. Why do we have to think about magic men? I don't get it. Something about like the Quran is that or women. Is that like they wear it because it has something to do with like them being saint soldiers and like being like prepared to like do battle or something. Is like it's a lot just like that, and a lot of other religious beliefs. It's just like outdated. Like, why do some religions not allow their followers to eat certain meats? Well, it's because like it was unsanitary before and like they fucking died back then, but now we have something called cooking. So yeah, they're just like, it's really outdated, and a part of me is just like, why? But hey, religious tolerance based.
I'm pretty sure they had cooking back then, but I get your point though.
Oh yeah, it was pork. Like they didn't know that they had they kept on eating pork medium rare, and like they kept on fucking dying because of that. Good job.
Fair enough. Thank you. Erudite, please.
So I'm just going to correct some really bad Canadian misinformation. Quebec is ahead of the times in some ways, but actually the Quran is banned on all provincial buildings. They just allow it in federal buildings. So in many ways, Quebec is behind the rest of Canada, as per usual. Here's, I guess, I think that this isn't
Canadian
super
hate.
complicated. The Quran is not actually in like the religious books. There's no regulation to the religion itself as to the length or the sharpness of the blade. I think it's reasonable enough for businesses to have concerns about like sharp blades being at school, because it's like possible that the blade could be taken. Like it's not just saying like Sikhs are running around stabbing people. It's like somebody could just take this kid's kirpan and use it as well. I think it's like reasonable enough to be concerned, but kirpans don't have to be sharp, right? So if it really does exist to just be a religious symbol, I don't know why you don't have a metal blade that's like dulled a little bit. Especially because religiously there's no dictation of how sharp this is. I think it would be completely reasonable to basically uphold kirpans, but then also like require like already most places limit the length of them. Like in Canada, pretty much always has to be under I think like basically at 3 inches. I'll need to look up the exact size, but it's a pretty small dagger.
That's more than 3 inches. I'm gonna say that. That's a lot more than 3 inches. But go ahead. No, again,
I think that's like 4.5 max. I have a pretty small hand. It's a small blade, and
the memes are making themselves.
If you can limit how sharp it is, now it's expressly just being a religious item, and then at that point, I just don't think there's any issues.
Thanks so much. Let's go to Tiberius.
Yeah, so I love the conversation about religious tolerance because I don't think anyone really agrees on what the fuck it means. So this is where I'll outline. One, pretty much any religious tolerance that you get is basically up to the Constitution, at least in my mind. If it really doesn't fall within freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, you're probably not going to be allowed to do it, or you're going to have a lot of pushback on it. Under our own modern ethos, we guise ourselves as a secular society. I'd argue we're actually like a Christian pluralism. And this is a really good instance of where we kind of see that, is that if this was just, something that was far more identified with Christianity, I don't think anyone would care. But because it's part of Sikhism, which is something that is really not part of the American ethos in any kind of majority way, this is a bridge too far for a lot of people. Because while it's a weapon, while it's a ceremonial, while it probably doesn't serve any kind of purpose, more Americans would feel at home with a guy carrying a firearm into this venue before they see this dagger. And I think that's kind of the root of the issue that we really need to drill down on, is this just cultural or is it more like this person is actually identifying themselves as a threat, even though they don't mean to, because of our cultural norms? And I'll end with that opening.
Thank you. Nina.
I have a really complicated relationship with this particular topic because I'm very hyper anti-religious, as our friend Chow mentioned as well. I feel very similar about the way that you do, where it's relatively antiquated. But I understand traditions are important to people. And in researching this topic, I found it's actually really interesting. You are actually allowed to take kirpans on airlines. And the requirement is that it has to be, if it's going to be on a carry-on, it must be worn underneath the clothes and stowed in a sheath, and or placed in a check bag or whatever. Canada also has like very similar laws on that, which is interesting to me. I didn't expect that. I figured dagger weapon not going to be allowed type of thing, but that means that we do have some respect to this. And I know I think it was Lactoid that mentioned earlier about like how far is it going to go when it comes to religious liberties on things. I would think that it's actually pretty simple in a lot of ways, where it's like if there is a very long historical context for this, and going with what Erudite said also, like where there's not really like, it's more of a symbolic thing, right? Where like there's a historical context to have it and it's just symbolic. I don't really see the problem here, because it doesn't have to be like, you know, like an actual, because I know one of them could be a spear too, and I don't think most people are allowing people on lanes with spears. But I think that there's ways to work around in a more of a modern context here to respect both sides, you know, obviously people's safety and people's, you know, religious freedom, because this country, being America, is based off of religious freedom. I think a lot of this also comes from with the video that we saw with the student, right? That was more, I think, of a disinformation, or not having enough like understanding of particular non-Western religious practices. And I do think that is a big issue when it comes to things like, or that's more of an example of that being an issue, where obviously it probably, the one that he was wearing probably wasn't sharp, because I don't know if you guys watched the video. It's a pretty, you know, small little dagger there, so it's not really necessarily even like a like, it's not like running around with like a samurai sword or some shit. But I think that it's generally oh, sorry. I thought she was responding to me, my bad. But I think generally it's just oh, sorry, hold on, I have one more point before I end. Last one. I actually was curious, and I was like, has there ever been a like attack or an assault with a Karpan? And there has been no, at least in the United States, no incident directly related with somebody using a Karpan as a weapon to cause any sort of harm. So as long as that's like kind of like the statistical case, I don't think it's a big deal. And neither does the TSA, even though they think everything else sucks. And that's how I'll end it.
Thank you so much. And my friend Aiko, my number one religious apologist, so I'm expecting great things from you, friend.
All right, so when I was reading this, the article that you sent out, I just think this is funny. The first thing that it said, first thing that I noticed, was that it said that the authorities here mistook the kirpan for a knife, as if the fact that it was like a religious sort of ceremonial purpose to it meant that it was no longer a knife. Like that sounds very Catholic, right? Like transubstantiation just occurred. It's no longer a knife now. Now it's like a ceremonial, like religious thing. It stopped being a knife, literally. You know, we might have to fight a few wars over whether or not that's a true statement. Before it can become truly Catholic. But I think there are three questions here. One is it a good policy to disallow these things? But the second is whether or not and this is a distinction that Scott made too, but should they be allowed to make that decision at a venue, whether or not you agree with the policy? And then of course, like, how do you enforce it? I think on the first one, I think that there's good reason to say that maybe with a few precautions being taken, like sewing it inside the clothing or something like that, that maybe you could allow these sorts of things in, and maybe the policy is too restrictive or it doesn't like respect these traditions enough. But as for it being like a right to the point where you should be able to like not follow these rules because you consider it part of your religion, I just don't think that's something that you could consistently defend. It would be a bit like saying, well, I'm Rastafarian, so I should be able to get to smoke ganja in my dorm room or something. I don't think, I think there are limits. I think there has to be a limiting principle in terms of how you prioritize like the safety of individuals versus, in terms of enforcing your policy. Versus religious rights. But then also there's a question of how this is to be enforced. Because if you were to because if you were to look at all of these instances, you have to ask yourself if they were politely asked and told, well, you're not allowed to come in there as long as you have this, like these are what your options are, instead of just like cuffing them and like
damn Charlie
doing,
Wilson,
you know, and detaining them. I think maybe they're
I appreciate it,
sort of as a happy medium with regards to how these sorts of things can be enforced. And also there is an apparent incident, I just linked it in the StreamYard chat, of an incident of a boy being stabbed by a kirpan in Sydney. So Nina, you're right, like this isn't in the United States, but apparently, you know, it was a significant injury, and I posted that in
it happened in an imaginary country, so it doesn't fucking matter. All right, let's
so
I mean, they are
I just
upside
wanna,
down, right?
Obviously, this doesn't even really support my position because I'm all for religious discrimination. I don't care. I'm also all for religious communities getting together and saying, you know, fuck the globalists. Nevertheless, I do have a question, and I doubt anybody here really can answer it because I don't think anyone here is like an expert on Sikhism, maybe, right? But I do have a question of this idea of like this compromise of like blunting the blade because it's not explicitly stated that it need be sharp. I do think kind of like gets into the same territory of like the niqab or the hijab, like where like if you're just covering your hair, but you're not actually like being modest, that like it kind of loses its value. And I do kind of wonder if, you know, something sewn into the clothes and corked and blunted kind of loses it as anything other than like cafeteria religion, because the whole point is that you are a spiritual warrior. I mean, like you're wearing the warrior beads, you know, like I'm just curious if that has an effect, and I'm wondering if anybody has any more information on that.
So I'm not an expert in Sikhism. I've just done a fair bit of reading on it because I find their religion pretty interesting. Everything I can find on the kirpan specifically is that it's not really about like violence in any way, and that there are people who wear kiprans who do actually negotiate the bluntedness. Like the bluntedness is not something I just came up with, right? It's actually being done. The kirpan is distinctly not about like self-defense or violence in any way. It's much more like similar to like Christians have like the verse like the meek shall inherit the earth, and some of the like old language that's used to describe this imagery is like a soldier with his sword sheathed, with the idea of like I can do damage but I choose not to. So they're basically never really supposed to. Even in like more older times when I've looked into like Sikh history, when they had like a shitload of weapons on them all the time, they still almost never unsheathed their kirpan, because the dagger remaining in the sheath, I believe from everything I can gather, is the religious symbol itself, not the dagger by itself, but being in the sheath is metaphorical to them. That's my understanding, but obviously if somebody comes on that's like, you don't know anything, but then like, I'll cow to them.
But what I mean is like, does it mean anything? Does it mean anything if it is blunted though? Like I understand some people want that compromise, and obviously they want to fit in, and obviously there's going to be, you know, a move towards not necessarily secularism, but you know, modernization and things like that. I mean, we see this in every religion, right?
Every religion.
Like
I mean, this
every,
is the kirpan.
Every fucking imam comes out with like a new hadith and like a way of like, and like a new fatwa of like, you know, we're going to actually determine it this way so that it's like easier to live in the world. I just wonder if there are going to be people that vehemently oppose the idea of that being imposed upon them, because the entire point is that I choose to keep it sheathed, right? That I have that capacity, and you're taking away the actual capacity there, and therefore it's a meaningless thing, because now it's not even like I'm carrying a weapon at all. It's like I'm carrying something that is incapable of that violence.
Sure.
Therefore,
and
my will doesn't mean anything.
And that religious debate will necessarily occur, right? The fundamentalists are going to probably have an issue with it, and then probably the more like liberal, more like progressive Sikh people will probably not be as have an issue. For example, the kirpan used to almost always be 3 feet long, and the reason why it's now actually ceremonial, it used to be a sword, and the reason it's
that's
as
not
short
3
as
feet.
It is. Actually, I'm sure you're super fun at parties. Okay, but like now the reason that it's short is basically because when India was basically colonized, there was like a firm rule of like you can have your kirpan, but you can't be walking around with fucking swords all the time, right? And so it's like that. I'm sure that there are going to be people in the religion that oppose it, but that's now like a religious internal debate than it is like society to that religion debate, right? If society like negotiates and goes, look, there's no religious thing, we want it blunted, you can have the symbol or not, you can be upsetty spaghetti about it, but this is what we work. I feel like that's now like a religious debate, and yes, of course some people in the religion will probably take issue with it.
I'm just curious.
Reasonable compromise.
Me personally, I just say, I don't care. I can't. I like, if you own private property, you should be able to ban whatever the fuck you want, and you should be able to allow whatever the fuck you want.
All right, what do you do for government?
The issue is that, like, whether or not it's seen as a weapon or like a danger to the people around people who hold the Krapan. So, like, Scott, the question to you would be like, hey, if it was maybe dull, like, would you be bothered by it if like somebody was wearing it next to you?
Like me personally, I am unbothered by the person with an AR-15 strapped to their chest.
Okay.
At Starbucks.
The true God.
This is exactly what I want.
To
ask the panel. I had exactly
this background. Normally, it's bags in. All right. This background was on purpose.
I wanted to ask, like, is it okay to be threatened? Right? Like,
feel threatened?
Yeah. Is it?
Are your fifis okay? Sure. Doesn't mean we make policy based on them.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the question becomes: is your education? Right.
Yeah, and it's exactly the next thing I have written down here, right? So, should everyone have to learn about like all these other religions, right? Like, is it our responsibility to understand your religious faith, right? And let's say like within the faith that it was supposed to be dull, right? But it's still in the shape of a dagger, and as you look at it, that's a weapon that this person just come in and he's strapped up, right? Is it okay for people to say like, well, yeah, this makes us feel unsafe, and people are going to react one way or the other, right? People just on the streets are going to react, and so because of that, you know what? We're not going to allow this because
it's like super homeowners association energy. Like unironically, like as somebody who's like worked in Canada where like the guns are not a thing, but I've worked on ranches where every motherfucker has like tons of blades on them all over the place because you'd never want to be out cowing or working with horses and not have a knife on you. It's actually pretty dangerous. And so it's like the idea that like some Karen would be like upsetty spaghetti because there's like a small dagger on somebody. I don't care. I'm not interested in kowtowing to your issues. And I think businesses that care about what these people think like are just dumb businesses. I am so opposed to homeowners association energy to such a like in a religious way. I never want to go
piggybacking. I have a quick quote from Ludwig von Mises. A free man must free himself from the habit just as soon as something does not please him of calling for the police.
So while I agree with some of that and homeowner association energy or whatever, I think there is still going to be an end point. There's still going to be a line that I think most of you are going to be uncomfortable crossing. Currently, there is a Christian sect which worship, like as part of their worship, they're very much interested in guns, and it's very interesting to watch. You can find a documentary of them. They have like
Koreans.
The Korean one where they of bullets and they're
crazy but based.
Yes, and they're carrying around guns, like they're praying with guns in, like they all lined up and everything. And
the kids all have like little golden AKs and shit.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact name of it, but I remember, I know it exists.
Like a wreath of bullets.
Like a wreath of bullets, yeah, that's what it was.
Yes.
And so I can imagine a scenario in which, let's say, okay, you can't put bullets in your AK because that would be unsafe, but it's a part of your religious expression. So, little Timmy can come to school with an unloaded AK on his back. I mean, at that point, would we be okay with like parents being like, whoa, hold on a minute. We don't want people walking around with even if they're unloaded, we don't want little Timmy walking around with an unloaded AK, even though there's no risk, that we're still scared now, right? We still are fearful of people walking around with guns. Now, of course, I'm in favor of open carry. So, I agree. You should just get over your fear, stop being, homeowners association kind of mentality. But I think a lot of people would have a problem with that. And I wouldn't think they'd be unreasonable to have a problem with it either.
Right. Yeah. I think
we don't even like it when kids eat their cookie into the shape of a gun, right? Like even that caused.
Right. There's a huge gap though between like a small blade and a gun, right? So like I think like I don't actually know where my line is, especially I'm Canadian. So like to be honest, I'm not forced to think about like carrying very often. It's just not really within my zeitgeist. So I don't know like where my line specifically. Yeah, I know. I don't know where my line specifically would be, especially with like different institutions. For example, I actually wouldn't have an issue if they even banned kirpans like in like public schools, because they're like, it's not a religious institution and we just want to have like wholesale, nobody has knives, nobody has any sort of like weaponry, right? I could understand that. I wouldn't be like that opposed. It's just this idea of like banning it from like all spaces at a like governmental level just feels very cringe. Feels like not at all what I'm interested in. And so yeah, I mean, religious freedom, the like constitutional line in Canada is protect public safety, order, health, and morals, right? So you can't like make a new religion tomorrow and be like, yeah, but we just like really love eating human fingers. We don't kill people and they consent to it and we eat each other's fingers and nobody's like, everyone's consenting. I think a lot of us would still be like, yeah, we still like don't really want to allow this to happen, right? And so like this is a really interesting thing, which is like when we're talking about religion, we often think about large conglomerates that have like a pretty cohesive like worldview. Like, let's be honest, those Christians are not really mapping onto like the general Christian like worldview. There's like a lot of Christians that would be like, yes, Matthew 40 and Jesus whipped out his AK-15, there's going to be a lot of argument within the group itself. But there is an interesting conversation of like, okay, if we protect freedom of religions broadly, how do we feel about niche micro religions that like emerge within 2 days? Because protecting something like as traditional as Sikhism, which has centuries of tradition, is very different than dealing with like a situation where like, what if tomorrow I decide it's my religion, like I'm LARPing as an aesthetic or whatever, to like exactly carry AK-15s everywhere I want to go in Canada. What do we do about that?
I just want to say World Peace and Unification Sanctuary Church, also known as Rod of Iron Ministries.
Yes, and they actually do. They will cite like Bible verses to support like a firearm.
Like,
they
do.
The rod of iron is like symbolic of the bullet, and so like they have religious arguments in favor of what they do. And so that I 100% think that drawing a line here, maybe was an unfair task, because I think it is somewhat impossible, right? And I think everybody has it somewhere. So I'm not.
Yeah, but I already proved why. Because you have public property. That's the problem.
Sure. So in the world of public property, where we have to set these lines, we got to draw it somewhere, and it's gonna suck, drawing it somewhere that leaves some people out and puts some people in, because you can use anything as a weapon.
But we already have this, though.
For example, in Canada,
like
that religious group in Canada, no, they wouldn't be allowed to carry their guns around. Guns are just not a thing in Canada.
But for Sikhism, it already is established.
Okay.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
What are you saying?
Like you can take them on like the TSA. It's already established kind of where the line is here.
You can't take them on planes.
You have to.
Did you not listen to my opening, my dear?
Your opening was incorrect. I fact checked it.
Okay, that they can be brought as carry-ons as long as they're underneath clothing and stowed in a sheath?
No. So according to the TSA website, they're not allowed on carry-on. You can check them though.
Specifically carpons.
Specifically carpons, yes.
All right, link it then.
Okay.
Let's go to
I'll be corrected if I'm wrong.
So
morality based off of TSA rules. I love
Scott,
it.
I love you, but if you interrupt me again, I'm gonna scream at you. Shut up, Scott. All right. All right. To answer Erudite's question, I did largely answer that for me in the intro, which is that if it isn't really covered under freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, you're going to have a hard time defending it, because there isn't really a doctrine for religious tolerance. And that's why we have this issue here where I call this Christian pluralism, because we're good at like integrating all the Christians together and maybe a little bit of Judaism, but we can definitely tell with folks who, celebrate Islam and among others, is that there is some serious cultural clashes and religious clashes that we do not interpret very well. I think we can all largely agree on that one. But I want to answer Prime's question too, because I think that's the better one, but I got to take a step back. Should we learn the other religions, right? Should we understand them? And I think that's actually taking a massive step back, really becomes that liberal ideology versus conservative ideology, and where both of them can fail. If you don't study the other religions, you generally just make it to where you stagnate. You're not incorporating any other ideas. Eventually, your society just kind of goes to shit because you don't change. I absolutely have a problem with that one. What?
I meant that on an individual level, right? Like,
I think this applies for the I think this applies for the individual as much as it does for like a group of people, because like even groups of people, they'll be like, no, we don't want to know about your fancy voodoo religion, but they trap themselves from having new ideas and integrate. This is.
But I'm asking. So I hear you, Ty. Like I agree with you. I want to learn more. I think the Sikh religion is pretty interesting. I want to know more about that. I want to know more about a lot of religions, right? That's me personally. But should the average person going about their life, right, like who sees a dagger, right, should we berate them afterwards for reacting? Because like for instance, the video I sent you was a college student and like and within their campus, just like sitting out in like the public space, and the police got called on them. Someone saw them and called the cops, right? Should we berate that person for not knowing, well, this is a Quran and this is not, like apparently not a real knife, or whatever, right? Like, should they have to know that to go about their daily lives? And if there are other religions that are more obscure with other crazy things that are like within public health guidelines, right? But still something that a person can find threatening, should that person know that as well?
No, we berate them for being unthoughtful. We berate them for being unthoughtful. If you see like a 15-year-old kid walking around with a small dagger on his thing that's like clearly dressed in Sikh garb, I don't think it's reasonably like he's probably about to go on a stabbing spree. That's pretty unreasonable. I don't think anyone would actually agree with that. And I think if you're that type of person, or if you just see a kid, like Sikh garbs are pretty distinctive, right? They're not your average American outfit. I think if you're looking at that and you like have no. What do you mean, Lactoid? Like,
well, so here's the problem with that though, because now what you're establishing is that we can determine threat levels by how people are dressed, and that is a road.
No. That is not at all what I'm establishing. I don't want anyone to be so autistic.
Trayvon Martin, anyone? He had a
hoodie on. They can't engage with the ideas that I'm actually talking about. I think it's pretty reasonable to expect people to be thoughtful, and I'm not saying we should legally berate them. I'm not saying that we charge people with this, but I think it's absolutely within our right. I will shame these people. I do all the time. I think it's fucking cringe if you're unthoughtful and your first go-to from like one look at person is to like call the police. Like I just think it's cringe to be unthoughtful, but I'm not talking
Look at the video. I'm not sure if you got to see it because you came in last minute, so no worries. But like the video of that college student, he's a brown individual. He's got like a little bit of a beard, not like a huge beard, but like a little bit of beard, like what I got basically, right? He's wearing like a pink shirt and shorts, right? Like a grayish shorts, and like sneakers. And he's got like the head, I don't even know what it's called, so I'm not going to pretend.
Turban?
Like the head wrap, right? The turban? Oh, okay. Is it turban? All right, so it's the turban on his head. That's the only thing that lets you know that he might be of a non-Western
Well, the beard does too.
I think the turban's a pretty big clue. I'm not gonna lie.
Hold on. I'm looking at.
You haven't mentioned
somebody's walking around with a burqa and they have like Converse shoes on. You're like, I'm not sure if they're religiously acting here or not.
Just for the record, you need both, right? Because it's 5 articles. It's the turban, it's unkept hair, it's the bracelet, it's the carpon, and
I think it's the sash that you keep the carp. I think it's the sash that you keep the carpon on.
And there's a comb.
Yeah, so if you have one, you have the other anyways.
Unkept hair, like Lactoid.
Yeah, oh, there you go.
Hey, I just had it cut. Come on.
But
it doesn't look that bad.
I'm saying that like
doesn't even
one way or the other. Like a lot of Americans, right? Like, and we saw this after 9/11. Can't tell the difference between like a Sikh and a Muslim, right? It is what it is. And it just is.
They can't find America on a
And then from there, like I'm a person who honestly cares. Like I care about when I found out that Americans didn't know the difference between a Sikh and a Muslim, right? Like I looked into it because I didn't want to be that guy, right? But I'd never heard of a Kirpan until today. So like to say that, well, yeah, you're being unthoughtful.
But would you look at this
no. Okay,
come on.
Prime. The difference is I want to back up Erudite here is that like you're at least open-minded, and like you're not defaulting into a bad reaction of fear and like instantly discriminating against people in like a certain ways. Like the big problem of post 9/11 is that like everybody was just hypersensitive over Muslims because like they see on the news, oh my god, Muslims driving airplanes into the Twin Towers, like oh my god, all Muslims are bad. Like obviously at that point you're running on fear, you're not open-minded into the reality that is like the vast majority of Muslims are actually really chill, but then like that has led to discrimination. So that it's not a matter of like being educated, but having the capacity to actually go towards the option of educating yourself and like not just falling into this trap of, oh my God, I'm in danger over everything that like you just don't understand.
So yeah, I want to add two
I'm in favor of
here,
shaming people
which
for being
is
stupid.
like, so like,
hey,
look, I want to say, number one, if you were armed, you wouldn't be scared about a dagger on someone's chest to begin with, right? So there's just that. Number two, moving on. I don't think people, I do think we have to like tread carefully when we start talking about like a moral onus on people to like have a certain level of education. But I don't think we need to be careful about that at all with the police officers that felt it was necessary to handcuff like some skinny teenager that was sitting there with like a turban and like a ceremonial dagger that was strapped to his chest. Like, I don't think it's that crazy to expect that cops go, hey man, we got a call. Like, what's going on? Let's have a conversation. And instead be in this situation where they're like, I need to protect myself and handcuff this teenager to like get rid of their weapon. And then we can have a rational conversation. Like, no, dog, like that's inherently escalating situations, even if it wasn't a ceremonial thing, for what largely amounts to a fucking pocket knife that isn't drawn, right? Like the weapon that he had on his chest is like no bigger than the pocket knife I carry around every day, everywhere, no matter where I go, in case I need to cut something, and it has something on the back end of it that can break windshields in case I need to pull someone out of a car and we're driving around. The idea that like this small fucking knife was enough to handcuff someone, to like detain him, to control the situation is ridiculous. But the idea that like a college 19-year-old kid got like weirded out because they saw some dude with a knife, you know, like we can make fun of them for that. But I also do want to say like that's a bit of a gray area because we don't want to go too far, because like I think Patrice O'Neill said it best when talking about racism, like, don't be afraid to be racist. Run, bitch. You can be racist and alive. Like, that's okay. Right? Like, run away. Like, he's like, if I see some black dudes in the middle of the night walking towards me, I'm not going to be like, am I being racist right now if I go the other direction? He's like, if your heart's telling you to run away, fucking run away. Like, that's okay.
Lactoid? Oh, so, and then Aiko, I think you wanted to jump in at some point. Did I not get to you? I'm not...
Well, I was only going to just say something quick that probably like won't get commented on all that much, but I just wanted to say that there is this tradition, because this was discussed earlier, of taking something in its original purpose, like the kirpan was a 3-foot sword or whatever at one point, and the way that it's shifted over time. And Scott was talking about how that might abrogate its original purpose, but I think that's something that happens in religion all the time. Like there's a tradition in the Catholic Church, for instance. It was actually really controversial. One time when John Paul showed up with like a sort of like 2 swords crossed that was like pinned on like his outfit or whatever, it was the unum sanctum. But the fact that the 2 swords were there, they don't wear their own swords anymore. But the fact that they had the 2 swords on there was sort of a political statement that the church has both temporal and moral authority, as opposed to a lot of people who think that it just has moral authority and shouldn't like have like temporal power or whatever. In other words, it sends a message. Like it's not itself a weapon. If the unum sanctum was ever actually 2 swords, I don't know. But the fact is that over time, things that are sort of become unnecessary sort of continue to stay sort of as a symbol. So I can see these things like being blunted or being corked.
The point that I was trying,
I agree that the Pope should be labeled the Time Lord, temporal power over.
The point I was trying to make,
and then I got to get to Lactoid.
The point that I was trying to make is that how you value symbology in religion is incredibly subjective. I wasn't necessarily saying like, oh, this is an attack on Sikhism as a whole. I just mean that like you as an individual may view the idea of having a blunted dagger not a big deal, and another individual may view it very offensive that they're forced or regulated in some way as they try and attempt to move through society, that they're not able to maintain their religious beliefs. And again, I say ban it all. I don't care. But in terms of public property, that's where the conflict is that you have multiple owners of the same property. And so because you have multiple owners of the same property, you have a forced compromise that will always oppress some people. The very existence of public property is the existence of oppression of people's rights and liberties. If it was private, they could just say, we don't allow that here. And other places could say, we allow that here. And there's nothing there except freedom of association.
Lactoid. I know. Lactoid.
Okay. The one thing I wanted to point out is that, although I do agree, Scott, that there's realistic understandings of threat perception, but then there's also just a concern that we have to be cognizant of, which is, when we look at somebody and they have a sword and they say, okay, well, we can take into consideration the whole situation to see if they're a threat. And one of the things we look at is a turban, right, or something else. We're implicitly doing something there, which is designating them as less than a threat than somebody who's not wearing a turban, right? So the rest of society. So if they have a sword,
that's not what's happening.
Well, but by definition, it has to. If you're designating them as less of a risk than like the general population with a sword, then what you are also doing is designating the general population as more of a risk
the population
than this person.
I hear what you're saying, Lactoid. What I'm saying is, like, at least what I'm talking about, I'm not saying that you're looking at somebody with a turban. I think another way to interpret this is if somebody is wearing multiple items that make you go, I don't quite know what's going on, the default shouldn't go, so I'm upsetty spaghetti about it. The default should go, I probably don't know what's going on, right? I'm not saying that an average dressed person poses more threat or that they should be evaluated at a higher risk. What I'm saying is actually cues of novelty should be integrated thoughtfully and go, something is probably going on that I don't understand.
Yeah, sure, what you're saying is New York is wrong when they say if you see something, say something?
What?
Again, the heuristic itself, when it's saying see something, it's talking about like when you see people like breaking into cars or like all this sort of stuff, that you should like call your
it was a joke. It fell flat. We can move on.
Yeah. So I guess. Well, I guess like the thing that I'm struggling
it happens,
with,
man.
But that's actually interesting. But Lacto, you can.
Yeah. What I'm struggling with is when you say like, well, is novelty to make us stop and think? In the context of this conversation, like, I guess I'm trying to get at the heart of what you're saying here. If somebody has a turban and they're wearing a bunch of different articles of clothing and they also have this sword on them, should they be assessed any differently than, let's say, if I show up in a hoodie and like a balaclava and I also have a knife on me? Should there be any difference in threat perception?
I think they just
I think like your
curiosity.
In your statement in itself, I think there's a problem in that, like, instead of maybe assessing somebody from far away, why not you just ask them what's up?
Well,
the person you're worried about being armed?
He's talking about heuristics. So if I just grant this, right? I don't like the framing of the heuristic direction because I don't think the heuristic has to be assuming risk in and of itself. Because for me, what I look for assuming risk is more markers of risk rather than just like, I don't know what's going on, right? So in the case of the person with the dark hoodie with their face covered, the reason why I'm going to assess them as higher risk is because they have markers of being more risky. They're not showing their face, for example, right? Which means that they're like being more anonymized. In the case of somebody who's just wearing stuff that I don't know what's going on, I don't think that should inherently be a marker of risk to people. And I think that if people would look at somebody with a knife and a turban and immediately go, that's probably a risk factor. What I'm saying is that's a really bad heuristic. Novel doesn't mean risk.
No,
sure.
I would assume they're cosplay.
The knife is the risk, right? Like not the turban. It's the knife. So like if you see a knife, I don't know anything about the Sikh religion or anything like that. I know a dagger.
I don't care. We're holding the knife consistent. Of course, between the guy with the hoodie and the guy with the turban, they both have a knife. That's assumed in the hypothetical, correct?
Right. Right. No, it is.
The guy with the turban not have a knife, or the guy with the hoodie doesn't have a knife?
You bought the turban into this a threat assessment.
Right.
We're not. So we're saying that like it's just a person with a knife, right? And you're saying that there's another article that adds some novelty, so maybe that changes the equation. I'm saying there's two people with knives here.
And I want to point out that even if you say...
We were talking about risk assessment, and what was held consistent across both situations was a knife was present. I was assuming that was baked into it. So then after that, we're looking for other markers about whether there's risk or not. And so I'm saying what you should be doing in risk assessment is looking for risk markers. And having like a turban, for example, plus the knife should be a cue of being like, this knife might not be what I think it is. Yes,
but you don't know.
Wait. Let me explain.
To give it a try.
Yeah. Let me quickly explain this. So here's the issue I have with the statement, because initially you said the clothing shouldn't matter when it comes to threat perception when I asked that. But this appears to essentially do the same thing. when you're saying that, like, okay, clothes that indicate risk, well, if somebody has that, well, now they're like, those are additional risk factors to go into that. But if somebody has clothes that are novel, then we don't assume that's a risk factor. So then they have a lower overall risk profile. But the effect of this is what somebody's wearing is dictating their risk assessment, right?
In this hypothetical, yes. Because I said from the beginning, I disagree with the framing, but I'll entertain the hypothetical because I'm not going to reject the hypothetical. I think a hoodie is also a really bad risk assessor, to be clear. It's a bad heuristic to say somebody with a hoodie who's covering their face is a higher level of risk. They might just be like an emo, edgy teen for all we know, right? I don't think clothing in and of itself is typically a very good marker for risk behavior. In fact, there are way better predictors of somebody doing risky things than like the clothes specifically that they're wearing. One piece of clothing that actually probably is a much better marker for risk is if you're walking around downtown and they have a balaclava over their face. But the same balaclava at the ski resort isn't a risk factor, right?
I'll say one last thing. I think the dissonance here that's uncomfortable for me as well is that there's one perception here, which is this idea of, well, we should be treating everybody regardless of what they're wearing equal. But then there's this other element of, are things valid risk assessments? And if somebody's walking down the street with a balaclava and a hoodie on, I will assess them at a higher risk than somebody wearing it.
I've never said treat everyone as equal.
Right. Well, sure. Well, I'm just saying, like, I tend to like prefer to err on that when you're able to, but then there's also this harsh reality of threat perception.
Sure, treat everyone morally similar. Like when we're saying equal, now we have to talk about what's equal. But if we're talking about risk assessment itself, no, you shouldn't treat everyone as equal, right? Like if people give you cues of risk, you should treat that as a cue of risk.
So, and that's the uncomfortable conversation, right?
But
because there is a racial implication there.
But let's go to other people who are trying to jump in. So, Nina, I think you were trying to jump in, and Jay Chow.
I have lost the plot here with that conversation, so I'll tap back in later.
Okay, Jay Chow.
Yeah, so Prime, I just want to like clarify your counterpoint to Erudite in like this hypothetical. Yeah. It sounds like you're just not concerned at all about the other articles of clothing. You just see knife and that's it, right? You're just tunnel visioning on the knife.
Yeah,
I don't. Both of them are dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because a threat can come in dressed in any fucking clothes, right? But like, I see a knife, and I know what that does, right? If I see a gun, right, like a priest can walk in with a gun. Well, I don't trust priests, but like, go with that. A priest can walk in with a gun, right? And just because he's a priest, I'm not gonna like, oh, I guess it's probably all right. Like, it's novel. I don't see like a priest with guns usually. So I don't know. Maybe I should ask first. Like, no, like it might be a threat.
Yeah. Well, besides like setting aside the other articles of clothing that might actually be a factor, I think context is really important in what we're discussing, because if like people see guns as like, say, a dangerous article, which I think it is generally, but what if there's like a military march? What if it's like the soldier who is standing by on the graveyard and things like that? Then all of a sudden, like, we see that gun as not as a dangerous article, but as something that is like maybe ceremonial or things like that. And I think in the context of religion and the Sikhs practicing them wearing this dagger, then it makes me understand that like, hey, it's not actually dangerous. And so then like, I totally understand. If you see a knife or any other thing, like maybe your first gut reaction, your first knee-jerk reaction is, oh my God, I'm in danger, or some sort of a fear emotion. But I think what is like, still what I said before is even more important is for us to be open-minded and for us to like have a sober mind and like kind of just like not give into that knee-jerk reaction.
I don't know. Okay, so but I don't understand this. So, like I want to be open-minded, but I'm trying to be like realistic and pragmatic here. So, if a person comes in with a hunting knife, right, an American style or Western, I don't know, style hunting knife, like strapped to them, and that is an article of their faith. And also there's other markers here because they wear combat boots and they've got like a shaved head, right? These are all markers of their faith. Should I go, maybe I should ask this guy what's happening? Or should I take a step back, remove myself from the situation, and call the police because they're bringing in a weapon in a place that is not allowed?
I
right?
feel like this is a
not.
panel where we're talking about sex, and you can tell that like 90% of the panel hasn't had sex ever. Like I don't even know who's talking about that. Unironically,
Don't shame
okay,
virgins.
stop zooming in so much. And
You don't know what 3
like-
inches is, okay? So don't talk about that.
Actually, first of all, I don't use inches in Canada, okay? I didn't want to say centimeters because I had no fucking clue if you guys would know what it is.
Fair enough.
Okay, when we're
I wouldn't.
talking about human interactions, you guys are focusing in on like really specific things in a way that isn't how people work. Okay, nobody just see, if you literally walk into a bank and you see a hunting knife and your immediate reaction is to be like, oh, I better back away. I'm sorry, you're fucking stupid. That's dumb. If you have a guy walk into a bank with a balaclava, he's got a knife, but he's kind of trying to hover it, and he's looking at the security cameras, yeah, you should probably back away. The idea that like the way that people take in situations is to be like, knife is actually stupid. This isn't how people work. People like look at the
this
whole
is
board.
your fault.
But you're saying that having the turban
no, this isn't my fault. This is because I entertain the
That's
hypothetical.
basically
No, this is your fault because you're saying I can't believe you guys aren't talking like you're in the real world. We're not like sitting, you and I are not hanging out on your back porch looking at the stars, just having a normal conversation. What we're doing is debating ideas. And sometimes when you debate ideas, you have to go all the way to the ends. You have to look at what those principles are.
So sometimes
This isn't
it's so
us not
fixated
doing
on the
that.
specifics that you lose touch of grasp, and a debate is useless if you're just getting zeroed in on like, well, do you think a knife should increase your risk assessment by 0.03% or maybe actually 5%? Nobody fucking cares. That's not important in any debate ever, because this isn't the way people engage in heuristics. The way people engage in heuristics and assessment is looking at whole pictures, which is why I'm saying a guy with a knife by itself might be one little thing that you notice.
Right,
However,
but you-
I'm not going to answer.
You brought up the idea. You brought up the idea of a moral onus being on
I
people
didn't.
to.
I literally
yes, you
didn't
did.
bring it. No,
You-
I didn't.
Listen,
I
yes,
said you're
you did.
stupid.
You
no,
said
I didn't.
You
I
said that we
they're
should
cringe.
shame people. That we should use social stigma against people that have this idea that like something is inherently dangerous that isn't, because and we should shame them for a lack of knowledge.
That's not what I said. I said if people are being unthoughtful in their reactions to situations, you should shame them for being unthoughtful. So if in a situation where in this situation, you see a kid with a turban walking around who is skinny and frail with a very small knife, if your immediate reaction is to call the police and then the immediate reaction of the police is to put him in handcuffs, that's stupid. That's
You're
what I'm
saying
saying.
the same thing I just said.
No, I'm not, because what you're trying to say is narrowing it into the specific thing and a moral claim. Me saying that it was stupid isn't me saying that they're evil. I'm saying that it's dumb, and that you should tell them, you're being a little bit dumb.
Okay.
That's a bet. That's a stupid thing to do.
You gave an ought, that one ought to make fun of these people, that they should be socially shamed if they don't put together the pieces of the articles of clothing and how the person is behaving, and they see a threat where you wouldn't have deemed it a threat, despite the fact that nobody has a crystal ball that can determine what isn't a threat.
I think Scott is trying to paint you as a woke scold, I think, is what he's trying to get at here.
Well, he's trying to say that
I
I'm
don't agree
moralizing
with that or
because I'm
not.
using the language of shame when I'm just not moralizing. I understand why you think it's moralizing, because a lot of people think this way. The issue is social shame is highly effective for situations that are easily correctable. In the future, it's pretty easy to not see a kid with a turban and a ceremonial knife and call the police. You could just not do that, right? Not that hard. I'm not saying that they're bad, ontologically evil people. What I'm saying is, for the better of society, we should punish that a little bit by going, not a good thing to do, very stupid, very small.
You are dictating a moral preference by doing so. Like, what are you talking about? When you say that society ought to shame people and that people ought to be made fun of for behaviors, you are giving your moral preference. You are giving an ought claim about how we should treat people that behave differently in those situations.
Well, maybe
we went into the minutia.
I'm giving a functional. If you want to turn it moral to, go fucking, I'll just bite the bullet. Sure, you're ontologically evil if you do that, but only a tiny little bit, and it's super redeemable. And if you just change the behavior, now you're not ontologically evil.
I'm just pointing out that you're bitching about us getting to the minutia that you fucking put on the table.
I didn't focus in on saying, let's only talk about the knife. From the very beginning, I said people who do that are being unthoughtful. It's bad heuristics.
Let's go to Aiko.
You're going in circles because you can't just accept that, like, you
Yes,
brought this up.
I'm
and that's
going
why
in
the
circles.
conversation was-
Scott, you're the
When
king
put
of
your
going in
hands
circles,
up,
bro.
You can't put your hands up like this, okay, buddy?
Peace.
Because I can barely see it, right? So when you gotta give me alpha palms. So if that was you putting your hands up, then give me alpha palms, not beta fingers, like down here in the corner, okay, buddy? All right. So we'll go to Aiko.
I love beta fingers.
We'll go to Nina, and then we'll go to Ty. I'm not sure if Corey wants to say anything.
Yeah,
right?
actually,
He's beautiful and Canadian, so he deserves a spot.
So
All
when
right,
I think about these, when I think about these things, I think about these things as rules. And the reason why we have rules is so that we can have like one policy in place that can sort of cut across a bunch of individual situations where actually most of the time it doesn't really matter. Like probably 95%, 99% even of people who would have like small knives in a venue would do nothing with them. They wouldn't be dangerous with them at all or whatever. But for the 1% that might start a fight, that might get in a brawl or something like that, we create this policy that catches all of that risk, or is designed to capture all of that risk, even though 99% of the people totally wouldn't do that, because it's hard for us when we're setting rules outside of texts maybe years before they're enforced. Like we can't know that, well, if a person's wearing this one thing, that then they're an exception, so like we should let them carry a knife or something like that. And in fact, even those people, like we had that example in Sydney where that was like a very dangerous situation where a kid with one of those with a kirpan like did attack somebody and there was a lot of damage. I think we might have 24 hours earlier said that you're not being thoughtful if you don't let that, if you think that kid has anything other than zero threat in the school, and then turned out there was some threat. So I think maybe it's not about characterizing somebody based on their clothing as to how much of a risk they are, but rather you just have a rule, and if that rule works like across many situations, then you follow that rule.
Oh my god. Okay, this is totally gonna backfire on me.
No. Look, guys,
Gotcha.
we got a lot of people who haven't got a chance to talk when I get to them. Nina, Ty, Corey, and Erudite, you're on the list. Jay Chow and Bactoy, all right?
Sorry, I get so distracted. I was looking at that Australian thing, and there is no sources for that, so I'm not really quite that confident. Not that it really matters that much, but
Yeah,
I mean, I think Oh, okay, because it's just this one tweet. I see the comments under it, but I don't disbelieve you necessarily, because I figured probably happened at some point. But like the fact that it's like so rare that it's like you have one situation in the like grand scheme of all Sikhs, I just don't feel like that is that much of a risk. Gotcha.
Only like 58 unarmed people a year are killed by cops, despite there being 62 million interactions. So I guess
what
it's
the fuck
just
is your
rare.
point?
So it does. Well, I mean, like rarity doesn't necessarily mean anything here, right? Like it's rare that cops kill people,
about, like,
so police
risk.
brutality
Oh my
is not
god,
a problem.
autoplay. Sorry, it autoplayed a video.
Also, in
We're
contrast,
talking about risk assessment here. Like it seems like statistically, Sikhs are not particularly risky when it comes to their weapons, and like. Sorry, I keep stroking my spit. Getting so excited.
I've been doing that all day.
Yeah. I do agree with Erudite, where I do think that there's a little level of understanding that you might have. Is like, okay, they're wearing something I don't get. They're wearing another item I don't really get. Maybe you could like extrapolate that into being like, well, maybe they got something else going on there, Like it's not necessarily like assuming that they're to the same level as like the average Joe with like a knife on them. And I don't even think knives necessarily inherently mean that you're dangerous. Like personally, I mean, I don't know if you guys think differently about that, but I don't see I mean, it seems like I don't understand this, so therefore, like, it kind of reminds me a little bit about the I guess I'm going to go a little bit more of a extrapolation of the shaming aspect that we were talking about. I know I'm kind of jumping a little bit here, but it kind of reminds me of like kind of the pronoun conversation where it's like maybe you don't know somebody's pronouns, and you might like misgender them, but like you shouldn't completely shit on them because they just have no idea. Like the idea of like the ignorance, as well as it should be a little bit shamed, like a little shame there, like to make people be better. I don't think that you should like shit on people for the reason of like not understanding of that. But I do think that they should have their own responsibility to maybe think that that person is different from them, and then you should maybe like ask or try and understand. You shouldn't be expected to, but if they explain it or whatever, then I think it's totally that person's value to understand what is being explained to them.
Okay, let's go to Ty.
Yeah, but like, okay.
And we got it. There's a lot of people in line. Ty, Corey, Erudite, J Chow, Lactoid.
Yeah, to answer your question, I'm not going to fault the folks that are a little bit more xenophobic, to be straight up. And the reason why is that to have the society that you want, where people aren't hyper xenophobic, is that you have to have a high trust society that relies upon people kind of tearing down their own walls to where they will be more liberal, to seek out new ideas into more cultures, more religions, right? That's really hard. And the reason why it's really hard is because there's too much bullshit out in the world. Aiko, I love you, but I can't keep all the shit of all the Catholics believe versus what the Protestants do versus the Mormons, yada, yada, yada. And now you're going to introduce all the other folks out there? Right. Like, so the problem here is that I will say that I do not find it in good taste to not try to understand others, but I do not find it a reasonable expectation to know the majority of religions that are outside of your basic sphere, right? Like, I can't condemn people for not knowing what Sikhism is here in the United States because it's not common.
Let's go to Corey.
Yeah, mostly just to understand Erudite's position better. Where like if I understand you correctly, which it might not be, but it sounds like you're saying basically taking into account when you're trying to undergo threat assessment, taking into account a constellation of variables, as in it's not just like the knife in a vacuum. It's like a constellation of other things to assess the threat. Or rather, and to approach it with more curiosity as opposed to like a conclusion.
I'm just describing what normal people do, and I'm saying if you don't do this normal thing, I think it's fair enough for everyone to be like, that's pretty fucking stupid, right? Normal people don't react to seeing a knife in public. For example, my husband, who is part black, walks into Walmart all the time with a giant K-bar on his hip. It's not the end of the world. He just says that I work on a ranch or that I go work in a warehouse afterwards. And most people don't call the cops, even though he's kind of dark looking. Most
is
people
a K-bar a knife?
A K-bar is like it's a type of knife.
Gotcha.
It's a brand, sorry. And it's at least 3 inches. There we go. Broke the tension. What I'm saying is, normal people, when they do like evaluations of what's going on, they take everything into account. And I think people who get, like, for example, in the case of the Sikh kid, either what happened, here's what probably happened. They saw a brown kid with a knife. That's probably what happened. What I'm saying is that's a really bad heuristic. That's a really bad way to map on whether there's any level of threat, right? It's terrible. And I'm tired of people having really bad heuristics. In the same way, I saved a comment in my fucking chat section because some dumb fuck said this. Erudite is looking too deeply into things. Knife equals threat no matter what the person's wearing. Except not, stupid. Except if you work at a warehouse, nobody is going to think that your knife is a threat. If you're working in a ranch, nobody's going to think it a threat. It's a really bad heuristic if you just like make this arbitrary rule in your head of like, anytime there's a knife, that's dangerous. Knife be spooky. And a lot of homeowners association type people will make like preemptive rules about how they have to socially engage in the world that don't mean anything. And I think that this is a really bad thing. That's all. I'm describing this and saying stop doing bad things.
The issue is that you.
So I think I understand your point. Like, it's contextual. Where the example that you gave with your husband Nick, where it's like, if you walk into whatever the store and they see I don't know that type of whatever knife, but from what I understand, you come from, or you're largely in a more rural area. What I can say is probably like in my city, like I think if there's a visible knife, there probably would be some sort of like call to the authority. I'm not saying that's a good thing or that's what should happen or that's what normal people should do, but also at the same time, like also a knife in a school, then that is understandable that someone would call.
Some places should have rules, absolutely, right? I'm not saying that some places shouldn't have rules. None of this is commentary on rules or any of this sort of thing. If, for example, if it turned out that a university actually had a really big bar on all people having any form of weaponry being openly carried, I think it would be even understandable. What it seems like in this situation is people saw Brown Man and they used really bad think and overreacted. And what I'm saying is normal people don't overreact to this stuff, and they probably shouldn't.
The problem is that you disassociate. When
it was banned.
Your original thing that you were saying is that the novel should be, and like the impetus is when you get novel information that you do not act, and that we should judge those people for not thinking. Well, that is what you said. You said that if you're unfamiliar with this situation and then you assume it's a threat because you're unfamiliar with the situation, that like you're the one not thinking, that you should step back and that your reaction shouldn't be to go towards safety or something. I would argue
I already said your features are fined. I said homeowners association type, people calling the cops because they felt like it was a threat. Right? I'm going to assume that people are not too stupid to take context cues into mind. If you see a really skinny Sikh kid with a turban on his head, maybe you don't know it's Sikh.
This
you
is
see
ridiculous.
A brown person.
This is ridiculous.
This
if
is
you're
how
alone on a
everyone
subway,
works.
if you're alone on a subway,
you're just making
and
a new
someone
situation.
someone comes onto the subway wearing garb you don't understand or anything, and then they have a weapon, the novel there makes you question your safety more. The idea that you don't understand what's going on makes you less likely to be able to understand whether or not you're in danger.
Sure, and then I'm going to assume that you're smart enough to actually look at the individual and watch their behavior and all the context cues. For example, if somebody walks into the subway...
And I'm going to assume you should be smart enough to get the fuck out if you don't know what's going on and someone has a weapon.
I'm saying that would be a little bit silly. I'm not going to lie. Normal people just don't do that, right? Obviously, if there is cues going on that there is a major threat, you can react to it. All I'm saying is touch fucking grass. Everyone realizes this.
Where are you getting this idea of normative from? You're saying normal. I don't know why we're appealing to normality, but regardless, where are you getting the idea that normal people react they're less likely to feel threatened when they have novel information?
Okay. What I'm talking about is just reality. I would say most people, for example, this kid was walking around with a knife on his chest, and I'm going to guess that 900 people didn't call the police on him. I'm going to guess one person did. And the institution apologized for it, and everyone seems to kind of, for the most part on Twitter, agree that it was pretty silly for them to call the police. Like, the place that I reside, in this world that I have observed, it seems to be the case that most people agree that that was a really, really silly, stupid thing to do. It was an overreaction because he was giving a ton of other cues to suggest that he wasn't a major risk.
Yeah, but that could be true of a terrorist. That most people see something and then go, oh, it's probably nothing.
Like
and then one person,
and then one person fail. You're correct.
Okay, but you're the one talking about what we should or shouldn't shame in this situation.
Yeah.
You're the one saying that this is stupid because it's not normative, but that doesn't mean that the normative is something we should be appealing to here.
Okay, I would prefer a world where, for example, we don't always just assume the worst in other people because there's one thing that we're hyperfixating on, right? I would like to assume that that is the way society works better. That's it.
Okay.
Let's go to Jay Chow and then I like to.
I completely
Corey, did you have another response?
Well, I guess my natural follow-up that maybe just to attempt to like distill down hopefully to the crux of the matter of like, then how do we feel kind of like about profiling, just like at the airport, as in like should those should it be like random searches or should it be like contextual factor taken into account?
Let's let Jay Chow and Lactoid answer that, and anyone else can jump in.
And then everyone else can guess what they think I'm going to say. Guess what do you think is going to be a reasonable answer for these things? Because all I'm asking for, by the way, is just to be reasonable. Knife doesn't equal threat. That's a bad heuristic. By the way, here's another shitty heuristic. Low body count means better partner. Or high body count in women means she's a dirty ran-through slut. Those are heuristics people use, and they're kind of ish reasonable, but they're mostly really bad heuristics. I'm tired of you people using really bad heuristics to function in life.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. So to answer Corey's question, like profiling is something that's like going to inevitably happen like all the time. We each have our own prejudices against other groups or even like against other people and things like that. That's just bound to happen. But what do we do then? Well, the solution is
and
then
I
how
took
we
that
manage
personally.
that profiling. How do we manage discrimination? And I think like I'm just going to repeat what I said before. It just like, and in a way, it's a lot in agreement with what Erudite is saying. Just like, have an open mind, not like give into these knee-jerk reactions. Maybe like even be curious, but like if you feel a bit like a fear and you want to get to a safe place, and like by all means go do that, like follow your instincts. But then to instantly, I say like call the police in order to in like a reaction, such as like there was in Central Park, some woman called the police on a dude for walking their dog or something. It was like that's an overreaction. Then it's like, are we invalidating their fear then? Are we like calling this person stupid or like shaming them or
that guy was
whatnot?
Trying to get
like,
viral videos by harassing white people. That's what that guy did.
I guess like my point is that like we ought to behave in ways that are proportional to the actual situation. And sometimes people just overreact. They just do things that are unwarranted.
Yeah, I mean, she's just not grounded in logic, and that's fine.
Let's go to Black Toy. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to try to bridge a little bit of a gap here.
Took it personally. I don't know.
I agree that shaming probably isn't the best idea, because you can't really blame people for lack of education. They don't know what they don't know. That said, I also fully agree that a knife is not really much of a threat, especially in the context given. Other things that are not a threat, open carrying or concealed carrying, the people who conceal carry, the people who open carry are dramatically less likely to commit a crime against you than people who don't. That's just factually true. So when you see somebody open carrying, statistically, if we educated people, they would feel safer, right? Just if they knew the realities of things. But that's on us for not educating them correctly on what the statistics are and what the rationality is. There is a problem, I think, that gets brought up here, and I understand that kind of the elephant in the room is profiling, which is, well, if we're going to start doing risk profiles, like, well, who falls in those risk profiles? Well, like men, for example, but then also like different racial groups, like, and then we start getting into some like really difficult territory. My approach to this is you should have a fact-based approach, not a shame-based approach. You should be based entirely on education. And every person's individual risk assessment should never be shamed, even if it's ridiculous, even if you think it's ridiculous. If somebody feels unsafe in a situation, even if it's because they're 0.001% more unsafe and they decide they want to leave the situation, that's on them. People can decide their own risk assessment if they want to. We can educate them. Well, actually, it's not that much of a risk. Look, it's one knife. It's probably not going to hurt you. Well, if they don't feel comfortable, they should be perfectly free to remove themselves from the situation, not shame them. I don't feel comfortable dictating what any person should feel comfortable with in their threat perception. Is it like reasonable for women to cross the street at night when a man's coming their way? Statistically, not really. But I'm not going to dictate to that woman, well, what you have to have this threat perception because I'm a man and I feel offended or whatever. No, you can have whatever risk profile you want, and you can live that life in however kind of a safe, kind of careful world that you want to. I don't think it's fine to shame.
Well, he's a skinny kid with a knife, so it's not going to be a problem.
He's probably not that much of a problem, honestly. I wouldn't think he's much of a problem, but if somebody feels he's a problem, I'm not going to like yell at them or make fun of them.
Okay, I'm sorry. Do you actually believe it would be reasonable to look at this kid and go, uh-oh, he might stab somebody. He's a real risk. Do you think that was a reasonable reaction?
So again, according to my risk profile, like I'm strapped at all times. This kid poses no threat to me, okay? But if I'm like a petite woman who's scared of this guy, maybe, I don't fucking know. I'm not going to.
You actually believe that it's reasonable based on this kid wearing a turban, being skinny, lounging around casually with a small dagger on his chest. Do you think it is reasonable for them to presume he's a high risk, I should call the police? Does that actually seem reasonable to you?
So the police response was ridiculous. I agree with you on that.
Okay, great.
But 100%, right? They have a higher standard. They should be trained to threat assessment. That's their responsibility, right? As a government agent. But when it comes to like your everyday person, I'm not going to dictate their threat perception to them. Do I think it's reasonable?
Was it reasonable?
So according to my threat perception, it's not. But again, like me walking alone at night, or a woman walking alone at night, like she's not likely to get assaulted by the man walking her way. I'm not gonna like shame her or think she's being unreasonable for that little bit of risk assessment going over what she's comfortable with and not wanting, she crosses the street, not wanting to walk by that guy.
Yeah,
hey, hold up. What if she
calling the cops?
Also, one last thing. I have a study.
What if she takes out her taser?
Yeah.
Body count
and then like starts fending off the dude.
Sorry, and what is with this thing about like the skinniness, right? Like his build. Like I don't understand this.
That's for sure part of risk assessment.
Male.
What do you think is more intimidating?
So he's a linebacker.
Yeah.
Of course.
But hold on, if it was linebacker size, then he should have been handcuffed.
No, nobody's saying any of this. Do you actually? I actually feel like
you brought in the body type, so I'm trying to assess the body type.
Do you think it's reasonable? Yes, of course, because a guy who's super, super, super huge is probably a little bit more intimidating than a guy who's really skinny, because if he stabs you with a knife, which is a physical feat, and he's super jacked, he's probably a little bit more high risk. But even still, I would say he was jacked out of his skull. He's the most ripped man that has ever existed on this damn planet, and he's lounging around with his friends with a ceremonial dagger on his chest and a turban on. Do you still think it's reasonable to call the police?
I don't think it's reasonable if he had a gun. If he was like chilling back with an AK, that would not be reasonable.
I think it.
Actually speaking, like the muscles really basically mean nothing when you're talking about a knife. Like it's such a force multiplier.
Yeah,
it really
exactly. I mean, it's a force multiplier. But
you think it's reasonable? You think it's reasonable? You're all actually doing.
I think you guys are hyper focusing on that she said the build.
I think it's hard.
Yes,
it's not that important.
I will say it. I think it's perfectly reasonable to call cops to handle something like that. And I fucking hate the cops. I talk about how much I hate the cops all the goddamn time, right? But like to say that, exactly, right? But to say that, well, I guess you should have known because the turban adds some sort of novelty to this, right? That it should have changed. It should have added some. It changed your threat assessment. That this kid has a knife.
I've never talked about novelty. That's too much. I get it. You think it's reasonable? I'll just say this again. I'll ask this. Sure. It wasn't
Brian,
a heuristic
people have called
at
on
all.
cops just by looking at a black person.
It
but
wasn't
then,
a
like,
heuristic.
by your logic, okay, that person has their justified feelings because we can't tell them what not to feel and what not. So, like, it's okay for them to call the cops just because somebody's
black. You can compare
black.
skin color to a weapon, sure, that's fine. But like what I'm talking about is the weapon.
Wait,
I'm saying all these other things.
So when you call the cops, would you agree that that's an escalation of force? Would you agree that if I called the cops, say I'm feeling uncomfortable, so now I would like to assert some boundary to get myself feeling uncomfortable. One thing I could do would be walking away, right? And I think that would be pretty reasonable. If I see somebody that for any reason I feel uncomfortable, I think it might be reasonable enough to walk away. Do you think it would be reasonable, though, if you see a guy lounging around with a ceremonial dagger on his chest?
What'd you call it?
I don't know. He said dyke, but like it was an accident. But no, it was an accident. It was an accident. But yeah.
Do you think it is reasonable as an escalation of force that because you see a guy lounging around to call in a bunch of men with big guns? Do you think that that is a reasonable escalation of force for that situation?
With a knife. With
a ceremonial dagger sitting on his chest. Yes.
Let's say this was the people who were running the let's say it was a person who was like in charge of that space, that college space, right? And they felt like uncomfortable approaching this person because they have a weapon. Yeah, I think it's reasonable to say like I'm uncomfortable doing this. In fact, that's what we want the cops to do, right? When people feel uncomfortable and might freak out about this, we want them to come in and lower the temperature here.
Or
Did
actually
he appear to be
the threat actually, as in better qualified threat assessment.
Did he seem to be threatening anyone? Did he have threatening body posture? He was just sitting there.
He has a weapon. There's no weapons.
Like ultra
there's no weapons allowed.
I don't care about all this shit. I'm asking you, is this reasonable based on his body language? Yes, he has a weapon as well. Based on the entire situation that we all saw, because I watched the video, is that reasonable?
Absolutely reasonable. It's absolutely reasonable. The guy has a knife. The weapons are not allowed. It is reasonable to say like, yeah, let's bring in the cops because I don't want to push this guy, right? Like I'm not trained to do so. Like I am the person who works there, the custodian who works there. I'm not trained to handle this. So
I don't want to get stabbed. You know,
I don't want to get fucking stabbed. Yeah, like it's absolutely.
Do you think it would be reasonable based on this situation to go, I think I might get stabbed? Do you think that would be a reasonable assessment of the situation?
I don't know this person. I don't know how he reacts.
Do you think that would be reasonable?
Don't know. Okay.
Is it reasonable to think that like a person with a knife could stab you? Yes, it's definitely reasonable.
That's not what I asked. I said in this situation with a guy lounging on the chair, hanging out with his friends, right? Very casual body language. He was lounging back like this, a ceremonial dagger on his chest. Is it reasonable to presume that if you went and talked to him about it, that he would stab you? Do you think that's a reasonable assessment of the situation?
I think that you are assuming too much here. I think that like when you're saying like, okay, well, these average people, when they like see this, look at this situation, right? They're looking at so many different factors and arriving at this conclusion, right? And I'm saying that like within the totality of the situation, where you have a weapon that's not drawn, right? And a weapon that's not allowed, a weapon that's not allowed, and a situation where like you are not trained to handle that, it's perfectly reasonable to call an assistant, right? And that's what we have the police there for these exact situations. So you're saying like, well, the line is like, well, you could get stabbed, right? But I don't even have to prove that much. I don't have to prove that much.
That's not the line. I'm just asking if this is reasonable thinking. I would say, to be honest, if somebody came up to me and said, even if it was a very small woman who was very insecure and she's like, I was really afraid that he was going to stab me, I would go, hey, Stacy, I get that you were afraid, but that was not a reasonable reaction. Yes, that is exactly how I would want to respond. Probably a little bit with higher empathy because I'm annoyed right now and I wouldn't be as annoyed with her. But yeah, I would think it would be completely fair for me to go, yeah, that was not a reasonable reaction. And I think most people would feel that way.
I think it's a reasonable reaction, though, but whether or not it was fair is a different story.
Yeah, and whether that should be okay, and that still is different from like whether you should call the cops.
Right.
Right, like whether you're
which are
at imminent
escalations of
danger
force.
is different. Is it?
It's only an escalation of force because we have shitty police.
That's good. Let's go to Ty.
I mean, like we had really good police. You could call the police and be like, "Hey, I see this black guy walking his dog," and then they would be like, "Hey, what else is he doing?" And they'd be like, "He's black in my neighborhood." They'd be like, "Hey, Stacy, like we're not coming out for that." Like it's only an escalation of force because cops suck. Like you know what I mean? Like.
You can train them to attack black people.
You can train dogs to attack people. Yeah.
I see a suspicious person. You need to investigate, right? All right. So I need to level here for a minute. First and foremost, I'm not a high trusting person. I've got some events in my life where that's just not in the cards for me. So whenever we have that situation or that concept of any knife is a threat, yeah, I actually largely believe that. Now, I work in a warehouse, right? Everyone has box cutters, but there is a normalized expectation, and I will go with Erudite to some degree where logically you should conclude certain things, right? The problem for me is that if I didn't know anything about this person, I don't know anything about this knife, I have a bit of a fear when I see this because this knife is not exactly small, and it is worn in a way that I would call brandishing. And I don't want to go down too much, but would I call the cops? No, but would I make sure that I'm at least like 10 feet away at all times?
Why would you call the cops? Yeah, sure. I'm not saying that you should run up to people with ceremonial daggers and give them big hugs and offer them lap dances.
Right. So like, I'm just trying to give the litmus test of where I'm at on this one. Would I call the cops? No, because
you think it would be reasonable to call the cops?
No, but also here's the scary thing with me is just I'm gonna make sure that there's more people between him and me. So if he does do something crazy, like I'm not the first guy.
Sure.
So that's the defense mechanism in my head working.
I guess that's fair.
Don't look me sure. Is that fair? I don't know if it is fair under
his internal monologue of the situation, I don't care. Like, it's not really having this tangible effect. When I'm talking about with shaming people, I'm talking about homeowners associations, people who are going up and making their feelings other people's problems. I don't care how you feel about the situation. You're just allowed to feel any such way. If you've never been around knives may be the most scary thing that you've ever seen in your life. I'm not upset that you feel that way. I'm upset by the actions that you take afterwards, which are unreasonable, right? Calling the cops is unreasonable. Pointing at him in the middle of the university and screaming, "Oh my God, he's got a knife!" would be unreasonable, even if you're afraid. Even if you're really afraid. All these things would be unreasonable.
Are we done?
Fear.
I thought he was.
I feel like we're at least on some level of page. I don't think she was replying to me. If anything, she seems to be yelling at you, Prime.
That's good. I love
my whole thing here is I think me and Erudite are at least on the same level of like what is like reasonable, but I will totally go to bat that if I'm just looking at this person, I am going to ID them at some level of threat. And like I don't blame people for being afraid. And getting to lack
for how they feel.
Right. And I'm not saying
your
you are.
actions afterwards.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you call the cops because you just happen to see a black person in your all-white neighborhood, yeah, I want to shame you for it. That's not a reasonable reaction, even if you're really, really scared of black people. I don't care.
What if you've never seen a black person before? What if you've never seen a black person before?
It would still be unreasonable to just call the police because a black person is existing in your space.
Hold on, yes. No, you've never encountered black people before. It's a totally novel thing to you.
So I've never seen a purple person.
Never even heard of a black person.
Do you think it would be reasonable for me to see a purple person on the street and then call the police?
Yes.
It would be perfectly reasonable if you saw a purple person in your neighborhood.
They're just walking around. Why would I call the police?
Because
people feel what they cannot understand.
Like there's nothing wrong with calling the cops. Like it's not something I would necessarily.
It's an escalation of force.
It is only an escalation of force because we have shitty cops.
This is
on the police.
Of course
not.
It
doesn't matter. We have the shitty cops though.
The cops should be better to handle the situation than you.
Let's imagine I live in utopia with purple people and all this shit. Okay, we live in Narnia and the cops are perfect. They've all got PhDs in risk assessment and they're never wrong. It is still an escalation to call in people that have weaponry and fiat and the capacity to arrest you into a situation. Of course it's an escalation. It doesn't mean it has to become violent, but of course it's an escalation. Even if I called my brother, it's still an escalation.
I agree with that.
Someone having the capacity to commit violence is not necessarily an escalation. Otherwise, we would all feel differently about the very thing we're talking about, which is the dagger that is meant to represent a capacity to commit violence.
What do you mean?
This is silly. I don't believe that you believe this at all, Scott.
Yeah, hold on, but Scott.
No, if I'd never seen someone before and never heard about them existing, and then all of a sudden I saw something that was totally out of wacko.
You're literally lying
unreasonable. You're saying I'm lying, but I'm perfectly justifying this.
Of course you are.
I said my personal position is I would be curious, right? I'd be like, what is that? I didn't know people came in purple colors. But other people might be afraid. And it's not unreasonable if a purple person with legitimate, like an elf, a fucking elf from Narnia just shows up and starts walking around the neighborhood to go, what the fuck is that? I don't know what's going on. I'm going to call somebody that's better equipped.
Oh my God, this person's going to cast magic on my family and we're all going to die. We're all going to be cursed. Oh,
no! But if an elf was there, you'd be like, what the fuck? Maybe they have magic. I don't know.
I would agree with my friend Erudite, like in terms of like an escalation that like
of course it is. Of course it is.
A cop who's coming there, an officer of law who's coming there, who is armed, right? Like now, now we're assuming this suspicious person isn't armed, right? But you've introduced a person with a gun, right? And so now the possibility that someone's going to get shot goes from 0 to not 0, right?
Of course it's an escalation. This is why I'm saying that you're lying, Scott, because I know that you agree with this. Of course it's an escalation. Ridiculous.
It's not necessarily an escalation, right? Like if you can so here's a question. What do you mean by escalation? Because you're not saying escalation of force, you're saying escalation, and that isn't necessarily grounded, right? So if my neighbor is beating his wife, right? You're saying it is an escalation necessarily to call the cops in that situation, right?
Yes.
Not necessarily
Increasing tension. It's making it more confrontational by nature.
But by nature, it should be making it less confrontational, right?
No.
If there's a potential threat and a problem, and I want the situation to be calmed down, I'm going to call the expert that is supposed to calm down that situation and de-escalate that situation.
So the police's job is typically when they're called to confront you. They show up and they confront you about the situation. And I agree, a good escalation doesn't have to actually end in increased violence.
Can you define what you mean by escalation?
I think you guys are changing.
What everyone else means when they say escalation, I guess.
No, can you ground what you're saying? Because if a cop were to show up in a situation like domestic violence, presumably we would want them to de-escalate the situation. That it would be better that the cops are there and there would be less tension, less violence, less likely for someone to be harmed because the police are there, if they were acting appropriately. So what do you mean by it's inherently an escalation if you see what you presume to be a threat subjectively and you call in the people whose job it is to handle those things and de-escalate those situations?
Which is an escalation, and hopefully they can de-escalate the situation. That would be great. But the initial calling and them showing up is an escalation. Of course it is. If I'm having a fight with my husband and I call the cops and they show up, even if they de-escalate the situation, my husband is going to feel that I escalated the situation originally. Of course. I genuinely, I don't know what to do with this thought because I'm sure
you've grounded it. You've grounded it now that right. You've grounded it now in the idea that any additional confrontation whatsoever, regardless of whether or not it de-escalates tensions, is a form of escalation. And by your very own logic, that would mean that it is not okay to call the cops in any situation unless escalation is sometimes good.
Of course, escalation is sometimes good.
Yeah.
Of course, not all.
You mean like when you perceive a threat?
Yeah, yes, of course. If you, for example, I've called the police.
So then it's meaningless to say that it's escalation as if that's some bad thing.
Oh my god.
No. Bro, I don't even know where to start with
this. What the fuck? I'm gonna go pee.
Isn't the Sikh escalating things?
Not when you perceive a threat. Just because you've perceived a threat is not when you need to escalate things. Right? When there is reasonable belief that there is a threat present is when you'll escalate.
I need a fucking committee to determine whether or not my subjective idea of whether or not something is a threat.
You're just being bad faith. You're actually not.
No, you're just not grounded in logic.
Do you think? Hold on. Do you think I actually? Hold on. No. Do you actually think I reasonably was trying to say that we need to form a coalition committee to vote on whether it's reasonable yet to call the police?
I'm following your thoughts through to conclusion.
Do you think that in any world that I think that we need a committee to decide?
I think that you have contradictions in your logic, and I'm pointing them out.
I think it's a problem of language. No. So, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe deeper than that. But I think it's a problem of language, right? You're talking about an escalation, right? You're asking like what kind of escalation, and I think that's fair. So I won't put the words in Erudite's mouth, right? I'm saying this is a bringing in the cops, right? Like, increases the risk of force being used. So like if there is no gun on the scene previously, right, and you're bringing in cops who have a gun, right, the chances of being shot go from 0 because there is no gun to more than 0, right? It might be just 1% or 2%.
More people die from stabbings than guns, right? So if someone has a knife, they have a weapon. That's
not my point. No, that's not my point.
Then by nature, you could be decreasing the likelihood of calling the cops.
I just said there was no weapons in this scenario, right? There's 0 weapons, but you have to call in the cops for whatever reason, right? They come into that situation. Now there is a chance that someone gets, right? Where else it was impossible, correct?
I mean, it depends on the situation. There is also a chance someone gets beat to death if the cops don't show up. And then they stop it, and then we de-escalate.
You're looking at
you gotta keep with his thing.
The answer is yes.
Yeah. I'm not talking about
if there's no gun present. Yes, a gunshot wound can now occur because cops have guns.
So it's an increase. That's why I'm not using escalation anymore. I'm trying to say it's an increase in the chance of force being used, right?
Not necessarily. No, that's exactly
not. The chance that force being when it's impossible previously to get shot, and now it's possible because a gun is on the premises. Of course, now there's a chance. It's not 0 anymore, correct?
No, you're trying to say that the gun and gunshots equals force. That is not necessarily true. That the two there's a Venn diagram, there's overlap, but people can do other things. Right, but like if there's some dude just beating the shit out of people, right, and there's no guns in 1,000 miles, right, the risk of someone being shot is 0. right? But if you call the cops who have guns, the risk of being shot goes up, but also the likelihood that someone is hurt goes down.
I agree. But that's not, I'm not going to that next step. I'm going to the first step, right? About like the chances of being shot. I understand what you just said in terms of like a life being saved. I acknowledge that you're right, but that's not what I'm talking about. And I'm not going to put words in Erudite's mouth. But like, it's just that like the chance of that particular thing happening increases. So that's what I mean by that. And Erudite, did that line up at all with what you're saying, or am I completely off?
I'm not even sure. Every single person except for Scott nodded when we said when the police show up, it's an escalation. Every single person agreed. Everyone gets this. I haven't even seen a single like idiot in my chat say that. And like, there's lots of Erudite haters in my chat. Everyone agrees with this. I don't.
And then I pointed out the flaws of your logic, and now it's a conversation.
Yeah, you pointed out the flaws of my logic. No, I'm just saying. I don't know if you just don't live in reality. I'm not really sure what to make of this. Everyone understands that if you call the police and the police show up, that it is an escalation of the situation, even though it might result in better outcomes, and oftentimes does.
Okay. You're right. We have substantiated that it is an escalation, and what you mean by escalation is them showing up, and there's no reason to use that term to mean anything, because we've also established that escalation, as you defined it and ground it, could lead to de-escalation and better outcomes. So the word really has no argumentative power here.
No, okay. You're just quibbling over semantics now at this point, like unironically.
Okay, so
no, I'm just asking you to ground the things that you're saying so that we can point out.
When the cops show up for the first time, it is escalated, and then maybe they're really good at their job and they talk to you, and because there's that threat of force, you decide, you know what, maybe screaming at my wife isn't worth it. I'm gonna go take a walk instead, and it de-escalates the situation afterwards. Just because something escalates first doesn't mean that it can't de-escalate later, of course.
Right. So we necessarily shouldn't shame people for calling the cops when the husband is beating the wife, because we see a threat, we bring in the professionals, and then they de-escalate.
Wait, who?
Nobody was saying that.
Who's the ghost here? Chow, did you say that we shouldn't call the cops when men are beating their wives? Was that you, Chow? It must have been. He's been quiet for. Oh, Corey, did you?
You're not able to deal with analogies. Are you not able to like see like what happens?
No, because you're saying that somebody in this conversation said it. You bitch. Like, what do you mean? Like,
no one ever said that calling the cops is always bad. Stop lying. You're actually lying.
I'm not saying that you said that.
Lying because
you're
you
just
want content.
Triggered.
I don't know. I'm not
just say
triggered.
that. Just why don't you just take the L there? Just be like, okay, so then nobody said that.
It's not an analogy. It's an actual straw man, because I've never said never call the police. That's never happened. And anyone who's listened to anything I've said would say, of course, Erudite would agree that you should call the cops when a man is beating his wife. Then why the fuck did you say it?
You're pretending to be offended, and what I'm saying is that an individual has a subjective risk assessment.
Why did you say it? Why did you say it? I don't care. Say all this extra shit and then answer my question. Why did you say that?
Unlike you, I don't have a problem.
Why would you say that that's an analogy?
Why would you say that? You can keep interrupting. I'm explaining it to you so your little brain can get it. Okay. Listen for just a moment.
Ask the question again when you're done.
So again, multiple times, right? I said that an individual has a subjective risk assessment. Okay. Some people see an inherent risk. Okay. It is okay for them to call the professionals that deal with those risks because they're better equipped to deal with those risks. I brought up the analogy of a man beating his wife. I admit to that. And the reason I did that is to show that there are similar situations where there are no principal differences, which is that an individual sees a subjective threat, presumably in this situation to someone else, but it could be to them, right? And they call the individuals in. No, Nina, I'm winning. Shut up so I can finish winning. Okay, so and what has occurred, right, is that the person has a subjective view of risk. They call in the professionals that are there to do it. And this idea of escalation is not a problem because they are de-escalating the situation.
Okay, I'm going to go back to my original question. You said verbatim, so we shouldn't call the cops when someone is beating their wife. Why did you say that? And why did you try to tell me that it's analogous?
Because I introduced an analogy that doesn't have any principal differences. Can you explain the principal differences here?
You're talking about risk assessment.
All right, we'll do so.
Prove it. The violence is already happening.
Hold on. There's a pretty big difference between somebody feeling scared about a knife and somebody physically committing a crime actively. I've never once said that if you see somebody actively committing a crime that you shouldn't call the cops. What I said is just because you feel some sort of way, it's not reasonable to escalate force. That's what I've said. That was never my implication.
Is it
You're
unreasonable?
Lying.
You can keep saying I'm lying.
Will you agree that I was not in any way implying that you shouldn't call the cops when active crime is occurring? Would you agree with that?
You brought up the idea. Hold on. You're bringing up ideas that are not my ideas, straw manning me, and then saying, "Will you agree that the straw man is a straw man?" I never said that you were saying that. So answer this question.
Verbatim said,
if I'm sitting in my apartment,
the cops when someone is beating their wife.
Yeah,
so did you
yes, because I introduced the analogy earlier. Okay,
how is it an analogy?
to address that
because you are an individual that has a subjective level of understanding that there is a present threat.
Ooh,
okay, you're saying one. So the question you're now saying it's not analogous because you have to see the crime occurring. So my next question is, if that's true, is it unreasonable for me to call the cops if I don't see any crime occurring, but I hear crashes, loud noises, and I hear, "Fuck you, you bitch, you always do this," screaming and loud noises? Is it wrong for me to call the cops to think, man, this dude might be beating his wife, but I don't have any actual proof that is occurring? Is that wrong? Is that unreasonable? And should that person be shamed for being a non-thinking person?
So I'm going to go back. When you said, so we shouldn't call the cops when someone is beating their wife, can you acknowledge that in no way did I ever imply that you should never call the cops?
Yes. The pivot straw man that you set up that I never said, I agree that I didn't say.
You literally said it. I have a clip of you saying it. I just listened to it.
I believe he said later on, though, that he admits that you never implied that. I believe
multiple times I've said that.
No, he said
I brought up the analogy. I brought up the analogy and said there are no principal differences. Your contention is that there is a principal difference, which is one is actively seeing a crime and the other isn't. So then I changed
my argument in real time.
Okay.
I really did. You're just using fancy words.
I'm not sure
you're just lying.
Can someone call the cops on this domestic abuse in here? This is awful.
I know, dude, because I'm beating the shit out of NotSoErudite.
I am.
No, you're just lying in this situation. I will submit
somebody who would probably.
Where's the lie? Where's the lie? You called me a liar. Substantiate it.
So the issue is that you said you shouldn't call the cops when someone is beating their wife, and you said that was analogous to my argument. But my argument has never been.
So the lie is that it's analogous.
Yes,
that it's this analogous.
That it's analogous when it was actually a straw man of my argument, and you know that because you know that I would never hold the position that you shouldn't call the cops when crime is occurring. You know that.
So your claim is that a lie. A lie is when you bring up an analogy that you believe doesn't have principal differences, and you have a difference of opinion that there are principal differences. That makes me the liar here.
You know, you're not that stupid, Scott.
Bullshit.
Oh, okay. I guess you're just not stupid.
You kind of self-owned.
We got it.
I am that stupid.
We got it. All right, perfect. Thanks all for that. That was. I'm not gonna say spirited, all right? That would be unfair to the word spirited. It was a thing that happened here.
Thank you for watching. If you made it all the way through this video, then you've got to like, share, and subscribe. Over 70% of you watching aren't subscribed, and it really helps. We're live on Twitch every Monday through Thursday, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern. And follow us on Twitter for more spicy libertarian takes. Finally, we all know that YouTube is a temporary place for dissidents. One day we'll upset the wrong journalists and be gone. Poof. But it doesn't have to be that way if you make sure to follow us on Rumble. Every video on YouTube is also posted to Rumble, and sometimes we exclusively stream there. Thank you for your time. All links are in the description below.